Despite a room packed with stone-cold killers, a sweating, heavy-set cleaning lady was the one who brought the meeting to a grinding halt. She leaned across the polished mahogany, breathing 6 quiet words into the ear of Denver's deadliest Don. His immediate reaction didn't just shock the underworld, it sent a chill through the blood of everyone present. Beatrice Gallagher was used to being invisible. At 5'4" and tipping the scales at 280 pounds, society had long ago decided exactly what to do with her. Look right through her. To the wealthy elite of Denver, Bea was part of the furniture, a silent, heavy object that occasionally shifted from room to room, pushing a yellow mop bucket or wiping down glass partitions. She was fat, a fact she didn't hide from or apologize for, but she knew how the world weaponized it against her. What the world didn't know was that Beatrice's invisibility was her greatest asset. Bea worked the graveyard and early morning shifts for Apex Commercial Janitorial, assigned to the top 3 floors of the prestigious River Point Tower on West Wacker Drive. The floors belonged to Russo Global Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar shipping and import enterprise. But anyone who grew up in the South Side knew that the Russo name didn't just move cargo. They moved politicians, unions, and problems that needed disappearing. The head of the family was Dominic Russo. Dominic was 36, inherited the empire after his father's sudden and violent heart attack, and ruled with a terrifying, quiet intellect. He didn't scream. He didn't break things. He wore bespoke charcoal suits from Savile Row, spoke in a low baritone, and had a gaze that felt like a physical weight. For 2 years, Bea had cleaned Dominic's personal office. She dusted the framed photographs of his ancestral home in Sicily, polished the antique humidor, and emptied the wastebaskets filled with shredded burner phones and redacted shipping manifests. In all that time, he had spoken to her exactly 3 times, mostly a polite, absent "excuse me" or "thank you, Beatrice." He knew her name, which was more than she could say for his underbosses, who usually referred to her as the big girl, or simply snapped their fingers when they wanted her to clean up their messes. But Bea wasn't just a cleaner. Before her father was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer, burying them in hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical debt, Bea had been in her 2nd year of law school at DePaul University. She had a photographic memory for contracts and a mind built for spotting loopholes. When her father died, the debt collectors came, and her legal dreams were traded for a uniform and a minimum wage paycheck just to keep a roof over her head. Still, the legal training never left her. While dusting the sprawling oak desks of Russo Logistics, Bea couldn't help but read. She saw the dummy corporations, the shell companies registered in Delaware, the inflated invoice structures used to launder money through offshore accounts in the Caymans. She knew more about the Russo family's financial architecture than most of the FBI agents sitting in unmarked vans across the street. She kept her mouth shut, did her job, and collected her paycheck. Survival was the only law that mattered now. The tension in the office had been thick for weeks. The air hummed with a dangerous, nervous energy. Bea noticed the subtle changes. The bodyguards, like Dominic's right-hand man, Thomas Vitti, were suddenly carrying their customized Sig Sauers inside the office instead of leaving them with security. The shredders were constantly jammed. Dominic was spending late nights at his desk, rubbing his temples, nursing a glass of Macallan 25, surrounded by mountains of legal paperwork. Through her silent observations, Bea pieced together the puzzle. The Russos were trying to legitimize a massive portion of their wealth by acquiring a controlling stake in Chesapeake Harbor Developments, a legitimate waterfront revitalization project in Boston. It was $1 billion deal that would officially wash the Russo name clean. The deal was being brokered by Arthur Pendleton, a high society real estate mogul with a reputation as pristine as his manicured fingernails, and Leo Valenti, a rival mob boss who was supposedly calling a truce to split the legitimate profits. On a rainy Tuesday morning in late October, the day of the final signing had arrived. B was supposed to be off shift by 6 a.m., but Mr. Henderson, her regional manager at Apex, had called her in a panic. The catering staff hired for the morning signing had messed up the coffee stations, and Mr. Henderson demanded B stay behind to manage the refreshments and ensure the executive boardroom remained immaculate during the negotiations. B hated staying past her shift. The daytime was when the invisibility wore off, replaced by the condescending stares and the subtle smirks of the corporate assistants sizing up her heavy frame. She smoothed down her ill-fitting blue polo shirt, tied her hair back into a tight bun, and prepared the espresso machines in the antechamber. At 9 a.m. sharp, the elevators pinged, the boardroom filled with expensive cologne, the smell of damp wool, and the underlying scent of pure, unadulterated danger. Dominic Russo sat at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table. To his right stood Thomas Vitti, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Across from Dominic sat Arthur Pendleton, looking overly enthusiastic, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers. Next to Pendleton was Leo Valenti, a man whose easy smile never quite reached his dead reptilian eyes. "It's a new era, Dominic," Leo said, his voice slick, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. "Our fathers bled in the streets over scraps. We're about to build an empire out in the open. Fully legitimate, 50-50. Dominic didn't smile. He stared at the leather portfolio. "Legitimate," he repeated quietly. "That's the word of the day, Leo." Bea was standing at the corner, trying to blend into the shadows near the ficus plant. She held a silver tray of sparkling water and espresso cups. Her thick thighs ached from standing all morning, and she just wanted to go home to her tiny apartment in Pilsen. "Sign the final transfer agreements, Dominic," Pendleton urged, uncapping a gold Mont Blanc fountain pen and offering it to the Don. "Once the ink dries, Russo Global and Valenti Holdings officially merge into the Chesapeake Trust. The funds clear the escrow account by noon." Bea moved forward, her heavy steps muffled by the plush carpet, to collect a set of empty coffee cups near Leo Valenti's elbow. As she reached over, Valenti shifted roughly, his elbow clipping her wrist. The tray tilted. A splash of dark espresso sloshed over the edge, landing directly on the polished wood, inches from the contract. "Watch it, you stupid cow," Valenti hissed, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Bea flinched, her cheeks burning with instant humiliation. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, pulling a microfiber cloth from her apron to quickly dab the spill. "Get away from the table," Thomas Vitti barked, taking a step toward her. Dominic raised a single hand. The room fell dead silent. "It's just coffee, Tommy. Let her clean it." Dominic looked at Bea, his dark eyes unreadable. "Take your time, Beatrice." Bea nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she leaned over the table to wipe the moisture away. Her face was hovering just a foot above the open contract. Because of her position, the text was upside down to her, but her brain automatically reoriented the words. Years of reading complex property laws and corporate merger structures snapped into focus. She wasn't trying to snoop, but her eyes caught the bolded text under Section 4, Clause B, Asset Forfeiture and Irrevocable Transfer. Bea blinked. She kept wiping the table, stalling for time as she scanned the paragraph. All combined assets entered into the Chesapeake Trust shall immediately and irrevocably transfer to the primary holding company, Aegis Vanguard LLC, in the event of federal indictment, to be managed by court-appointed receivership. Aegis Vanguard LLC. Bee's breath hitched. She remembered cleaning Dominic's office 3 nights ago. She had accidentally knocked a file folder onto the floor. It was a dossier on Leo Valenti's recent movements. One of the pages was a surveillance report detailing Valenti's secret meetings with the district attorney. The DA's task force was running a shadow corporation to seize mob assets. The name of the shadow corporation was Aegis Vanguard LLC. This wasn't a truce. It wasn't a business deal. It was a beautifully wrapped, billion-dollar federal trap. If Dominic signed that paper, he wasn't just merging his assets. He was legally signing away his entire empire directly to the federal government the second they indicted him, which they would likely do the moment the ink dried. Leo Valenti had flipped. He was wearing a wire, or he was working with the feds for immunity. Bee's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. She was just a fat, invisible cleaning lady. It was not her place to speak. If she opened her mouth, she could be killed. If she didn't, the Russo family would fall, and honestly, the world would probably be a better place. They were criminals. But Dominic Russo had never treated her like she was invisible. He had never mocked her size. He knew her name. And right now, he was reaching for the gold Mont Blanc pen. Bee leaned in closer. She lowered her head, her face hidden by her uniform collar from the rest of the room, and positioned her mouth inches from Dominic's ear. Her voice was barely a breath, a rapid, terrified whisper that only he could hear. "Don't sign it. Clause 4B transfers everything to Aegis Vanguard. It's a federal trap. Valenti is a rat." Dominic's hand froze a millimeter above the paper. He didn't gasp. He didn't snap his head to look at her. Bee immediately straightened up, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. She backed away from the table, clutching her dirty cloth. "All clean, Mr. Russo. I apologize again for the interruption." Dominic slowly retracted his hand from the pen. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a piano wire. Leo Valenti shifted in his seat, a microscopic bead of sweat forming at his temple. Pendleton swallowed hard. "Is there a problem, Dominic?" Valenti asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Ink dried up?" Dominic leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. His eyes flicked to Bear, who was standing by the door, trembling. He looked back at Valenti. "You know, Leo," Dominic said smoothly, "I'm a man who believes in the fine print. And I just remembered something about the architecture of this specific trust." Dominic stood up abruptly. He didn't reach for the pen. Instead, he reached into his bespoke suit jacket. What he did next happened so fast, Bee barely had time to process it. Dominic bypassed his gun entirely. He grabbed the heavy, solid brass espresso tamper sitting on the coffee cart next to him, lunged across the table, and smashed it directly into Leo Valenti's left hand, pinning it to the mahogany table with a sickening crunch of bone. Valenti shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute agony, as Thomas Vitti and the Russo bodyguards drew their weapons in a blur of motion, aiming them directly at the heads of Valenti's men and Arthur Pendleton. "Tommy," Dominic said softly, leaning over the screaming Valenti. "Check his chest. Under the shirt." Thomas ripped Valenti's custom silk shirt open. Taped directly to his sternum, blinking with a tiny red light, was an FBI recording wire. The boardroom erupted into chaos, but Dominic Russo's eyes bypassed the screaming mobster and locked directly onto the terrified plus-size cleaner cowering by the door. The boardroom descended into a beautifully orchestrated, terrifyingly silent chaos. As Leo Valenti's agonized screams echoed off the soundproof glass, Dominic's men moved with the precision of a military strike team. Thomas Vitti yanked the bleeding mobster out of his chair by the collar, dragging him toward the private executive elevator that led directly to the underground parking garage. The FBI wire was crushed under Thomas's heel before he dragged Valenti out of sight. Arthur Pendleton, the polished real estate mogul, had collapsed into a quivering mess, weeping openly onto the mahogany table. Dominic ignored him completely. Instead, he ripped the billion-dollar contract into halves, then quarters, and dropped the pieces into his wastebasket. Through it all, Beatrice stood frozen against the wall. Her heavy chest heaved, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her cleaning cloth. She had just interrupted a mafia war. She knew too much. She closed her eyes, waiting for a bullet. "Clear the room," Dominic commanded quietly. "Put Mr. Pendleton in a car, and tell him if he ever returns to Denver, I'll have him buried under his own waterfront development." Within 60 seconds, the room was empty, save for Dominic, 2 armed guards at the door, and the heavy-set cleaning lady trembling by the ficus plant. Suddenly, the wail of police sirens pierced the morning air. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Bea could see dozens of black Suburbans swarming the River Point Plaza below. The FBI was raiding the building, expecting a signed confession on paper and an open wire. They were about to find absolutely nothing. Dominic straightened his suit jacket, calmly pouring himself a fresh espresso from the cart Bea had prepared. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Come here," he said. Bea's legs felt like lead, but survival instinct propelled her forward. She walked toward the head of the table, painfully aware of her bulky, ill-fitting uniform, and the way her thick thighs brushed together with every step. She stopped a respectful distance away, keeping her eyes pinned to the floor. "Look at me," Dominic ordered softly. She raised her head. Dominic Russo was staring at her with an intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. He wasn't looking at her with the usual mixture of pity and disgust she was accustomed to. He was looking at her like she was a locked safe he was determined to crack. How does a woman pushing a mop know the intricacies of federal forfeiture laws and the existence of Aegis Vanguard? He asked. Bea swallowed hard. I read your files, sir. By accident. When I was dusting. Nobody reads high-level legal jargon by accident and comprehends it in a split second upside down. Dominic countered, stepping closer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated heat and authority. "Who are you, Beatrice?" "I was a law student," she blurted out, her defense mechanisms kicking in. "DePaul University. I was top of my class in corporate law and federal tax loopholes. My professor was attorney Robert Clifford, the real one, the guy who sued the airlines. I was supposed to intern at his firm. But my dad got sick. Pancreatic cancer. He was treated at Northwestern Memorial, and the experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance. When he died, the debt collectors came for our house. I had to drop out to pay the bills. Janitorial work paid cash under the table for the night shifts. That's it. I'm just a cleaner." Ooh, Dominic fell silent. He looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately. For the first time in her life, a man's gaze on her heavy body didn't feel like an insult. It felt heavy, possessive. Down the hall, the elevator banks dinged loudly. The feds had breached the floor. "Take off the apron, Beatrice," Dominic said abruptly. "What?" "Take off the apron. Sit in that chair." You are no longer a cleaner. As of this exact second, you are the junior legal counsel for Russo Global Logistics. Before Bia could process the demand, the heavy oak doors burst open. A dozen FBI agents flooded the room, led by a smug-looking special agent in a cheap tan suit. "Nobody move! FBI!" the agent barked, holding up a warrant. "Dominic Russo, you are under arrest for federal racketeering and conspiracy. We know Valenti was wearing a wire. We know about the Chesapeake Trust." Dominic didn't even blink. He took another sip of his espresso. "Agent Miller, you're early for our quarterly audit. And as for Mr. Valenti, he left 10 minutes ago. He spilled his coffee, grew embarrassed, and decided to cancel the deal. There is no trust. There is no contract." Miller sneered, marching toward the table. "You expect me to believe that?" He looked down at the empty table, his face dropping when he saw no paperwork, no gold pen, and no Valenti. His eyes darted to Bea, who was sitting stiffly in the leather chair, her hands folded over her stomach, heart hammering. "Who is she?" Miller snapped. "Another one of your mob wives." Dominic's jaw clenched, a flash of pure, lethal anger sparking in his eyes. He stepped in front of Bea, shielding her with his body. "Watch your mouth, Miller. This is Beatrice Gallagher. She is my private corporate counsel, and unless you have a warrant to search my attorney's briefs, or you want a harassment lawsuit filed in federal court before lunch, I suggest you get out of my boardroom." Miller glared, searching the room frantically for the shredded contract, but Thomas Vitti had already taken the wastebasket down the private chute. Defeated, red-faced, and furious, Miller ordered his men out. When the doors closed, the silencer returned. Dominic turned back to Bea. She was shaking, tears of pure adrenaline pricking her eyes. Dominic reached down, his large, calloused hand gently gripping her chin. He tilted her face up to meet his gaze. His thumb brushed softly across her cheekbone. "You just saved my life, Beatrice," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "You saved my empire, my freedom, and my family. The world looked at you and thought you were invisible because of your size. They thought you were just the fat girl with the mop. They were fools." "What happens now?" she whispered, terrified of the answer. "Now," Dominic said, a dangerous, possessive smirk pulling at his lips, "I pay off the rest of your father's medical debt, and you go buy some new clothes, because you're moving into the penthouse office, and you're working directly for me." 6 months. In the criminal underworld, 6 months was an eternity. For Beatrice Gallagher, it was enough time to completely rewrite the trajectory of her life. She stood before the gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror in her Gold Coast penthouse, a sprawling, glass-walled sanctuary, paid for in full by Russo Global Logistics. She took a deep breath, adjusting the sweetheart neckline of her custom-made gown. The dress was a breathtaking masterpiece of deep, emerald silk, meticulously constructed by a private Milanese tailor Dominic had flown in just for her. For the first 26 years of her life, Beatrice had hidden her 280-pound frame beneath oversized hoodies, baggy sweatpants, and shapeless blue janitorial uniforms. She had been conditioned by a cruel world to view her broad hips, thick thighs, and heavy stomach as a liability, an anchor that dragged her down in a society obsessed with sharp edges and hollow cheekbones. Dominic Russo didn't like sharp edges. Over the last half-year, he had made it his personal mission to show her exactly how much he revered her curves. Beatrice was no longer the invisible woman pushing a mop bucket through the silent, dimly lit corridors of Wacker Drive. She was now the most terrifying legal weapon in the Denver Mafia's arsenal. Operating as the senior private counsel for Russo Global, she didn't need a customized firearm to bring grown men to their knees. Her weapon was a leather briefcase. Over the past 6 months, she had ruthlessly audited the Russo family's entire portfolio, weaving their illicit wealth through a labyrinth of legitimate commercial real estate developments, art acquisitions, and offshore philanthropic trusts. She exploited federal tax loopholes with a photographic memory and a predatory instinct that left the FBI's financial task force constantly chasing their own tails. She had made Dominic absolutely untouchable, yet the boardroom victories paled in comparison to the electric, unspoken tension between them. Late nights in his mahogany-paneled study were filled with heavy, lingering glances. He would order lavish 5-course meals from the city's Michelin-starred kitchens, sitting across from her and watching her eat with a dark, unyielding hunger of his own. He never asked her to change. He treated her like a goddess, and Beatrice was falling dangerously, irrevocably in love with the most lethal man in Illinois. Tonight was their public coronation. Russo Global was hosting a massive philanthropic gala at the historic Palmer House Hilton, signaling their complete integration into Denver's legitimate high society. Stepping out of the chauffeured Maybach, Beatrice felt the immediate burn of 100 judgmental eyes. As she walked into the grand lobby, cameras flashed in a blinding staccato. The wives of senators and hedge fund managers, draped in their size 2 designer gowns, paused their conversations to sneer over their champagne flutes, sizing up the massive, imposing woman on the arm of the city's most eligible, dangerous bachelor. Dominic, dressed in a flawless charcoal tuxedo, didn't care about the politicians. When he looked at Beatrice, the rest of the world ceased to exist. He stepped close, his large hand resting protectively against the small of her back. "Let them stare," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "They are looking at the woman who holds my life in her hands. You are magnificent, Bea." As they entered the opulent Empire Room, filled with the sweeping melodies of a live string quartet, Beatrice's smile remained radiant. The law school dropout, who used to watch from the shadows, had trained herself to notice what others missed. She scanned the room, automatically categorizing the exits, the blind spots, and the movement of the catering staff. A waiter passed by, balancing a silver tray of caviar blinis. His posture was too rigid. His eyes darted nervously toward the chandelier instead of the guests. But it was the tiny, polished lapel pin on his white jacket that made Beatrice's blood turn to ice. A silver anchor. Just weeks prior, while liquidating the seized assets of the disgraced Valenti family, she had flagged a dormant shell company named Iron Anchor Hospitality. It was an old ghost corporation Leo Valenti had historically used to funnel cash to contract killers. She systematically swept her gaze across the ballroom. 3 waiters by the east doors, 2 near the kitchen, 1 directly behind the mayor's table, all wearing silver anchor pins. They had bypassed Thomas Vitti's security by infiltrating the high-end catering company. They weren't holding serving trays. They were hiding suppressed firearms under the silver cloches. Beatrice didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. Slipping her arm through Dominic's, she pressed her full, soft chest flush against his bicep, leaning her head on his shoulder as if sharing a sweet, private joke. Her voice was a razor blade disguised as a whisper. "Do not look around," she breathed, keeping her bright smile perfectly pinned in place for the cameras. "Waiters with silver anchor pins. 6 total. East doors and kitchen entrance. It's Valenti's front company. They have weapons under the cloches. You have 20 seconds before they move." Dominic's laughter boomed, a rich, believable sound that echoed through the nearby crowd. But underneath the tuxedo jacket, every muscle in his body pulled taut as steel cable. He didn't doubt her for a fraction of a second. Still smiling, he tapped his left earpiece, issuing a coded, silent command to Thomas Vitti and the Russo snipers positioned in the mezzanine. Dominic seamlessly twirled Beatrice out of the center of the room, pulling her into the heavy, velvet-draped alcove of the service corridor. The second the curtain fell behind them, chaos erupted silently. Under the cover of a sweeping crescendo from the string quartet, Thomas Vitti and a dozen undercover Russo enforcers descended on the fake waiters. Thuds and muffled grunts echoed near the exits, but to the oblivious politicians, sipping Dom Perignon, it merely looked like a few clumsy staff members were being aggressively escorted out for dropping glassware. In the dim light of the alcove, Dominic slammed his back against the wall, pulling Beatrice tightly against his chest. His heart hammered wildly against her own. "You did it again," he rasped, his hands gripping her thick hips with a bruising, desperate intensity. "You see everything, my brilliant girl." "They were going to butcher you," she choked out, the adrenaline finally crashing down on her as tears welled in her eyes. "Dominic, I thought—" He silenced her with a crushing, consuming kiss. It was raw and possessive, a violent clash of terror and absolute adoration. His large hands mapped the heavy curves of her waist and thighs, holding her as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. "I don't care about the Empire," he whispered fiercely against her lips. "I only care about you. You hid yourself away because this world made you feel unworthy of taking up space. Never again." When they finally emerged from the shadows, the ballroom was safe. Thomas gave a sharp, imperceptible nod from across the room. Dominic led Beatrice directly to the center of the dance floor. The elite crowd parted, whispering once more, but this time in pure awe. The deadliest Don in Denver wrapped his arms around his curvy, brilliant queen, holding her close for all the world to see. A silent promise that while he ruled the underworld, she ruled him. If Beatrice's brilliant rise from an overlooked cleaner to a fierce mafia queen kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Do you think you could have spotted the Fed's trap under pressure like she did? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends who love drama, twists, and a romance that breaks all the rules. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories.